She washed clothes for 40 years. At 69, she became a designer. Welcome back and enjoy the story. The morning fog clung to the narrow alley as Ellen dipped her hands into the freezing basin of soapy water. Her knuckles were cracked, red and raw. Years of detergent and cold water had eaten through her skin and her dreams. For 40 years, she had washed other people's clothes, silk dresses that weren't hers, suits that smelled of money, uniforms with names stitched on them, names that got respect, doors opened for them. Her name, on the other hand, was known only by a few, and none remembered it with kindness. At home, the walls of her tiny room dripped with humidity. The smell of damp clothes and bleach never left her fingers. Her bed was a thin mattress on the floor, beside the sewing machine her mother had gifted her before dying. That old Singer machine was the only thing Ellen ever loved, besides her son, who now lived far away, ashamed of the woman who still ironed and folded strangers' underwear. The early winter light filtered weakly through the single window of her basement apartment. Ellen's fingers ached as she reached for another shirt from the pile. Chicago winters were brutal, especially in this part of the city, where heat was a luxury and warm water an afterthought. She had been up since 4, preparing for the day's deliveries. Mrs. Harrington's silk blouses needed special attention, and Mr. Peterson's suits couldn't have a single wrinkle. One mistake could mean losing a client, and at 69, Ellen couldn't afford that. She glanced at the small framed photograph on her nightstand, the only decoration in her sparse room. It showed a younger version of herself, holding a small boy with bright eyes and a gap-toothed smile. Freddie. Her heart constricted at the thought of him. 20 years had passed since he'd left Chicago, determined to erase his humble beginnings. 10 years since his last reluctant phone call. A knock at the door startled Ellen from her reverie. She wiped her hands on her apron and shuffled across the concrete floor. "Mail for you, Mrs. Martinez," said the building superintendent, thrusting a brown envelope through the crack in the door. "Thank you, Mr. Jenkins," Ellen replied, accepting the envelope with trembling hands. She recognized her son's neat handwriting immediately. Her heart leaped. Maybe a letter, a photo of her granddaughter she'd never met. Ellen settled into her threadbare armchair and carefully opened the envelope. She smiled in anticipation, but her smile faded as she unfolded the typed note. "Mom, stop writing me. Please respect my new life. I told them I was raised by a nurse. Don't ruin this for me." Her eyes filled with tears that didn't fall, not because she didn't feel the pain, but because she had learned long ago how to keep pain inside. Crying wasted time, and she had work to do. The paper trembled in her hands. She folded it carefully, along its creases, and tucked it into the pocket of her dress. 40 years of washing other people's clothes had taught her one thing: how to scrub away stains, how to make things appear clean and perfect, even when they were irreparably damaged underneath. Ellen returned to her workstation, mechanically, sorting clothes by fabric type, her mind drifting to a conversation from years ago. Freddie had been 16, bright and ambitious. "I'm going to college, Mom," he'd announced. "I'm going to be somebody." "You already are somebody," she'd told him, but he'd just shaken his head. "Nobody respects the son of a washerwoman," he'd said, the words cutting deeper than any knife. That same night, while Freddie slept, Ellen stitched a little dress from leftover scraps just to keep her hands busy. It had delicate ruffles and tiny embroidered flowers. No one would see it. No one ever saw anything she made, but she kept sewing. Every time someone screamed at her, "You missed a stain," or refused to pay because the collar wasn't folded right, she'd go home, thread her needle, and escape for a while. Dresses, jackets, blouses, each piece a small act of defiance against the world that only saw her as a washerwoman. The morning stretched into afternoon, and Ellen methodically worked through her piles of laundry. Mrs. Harrison's silk blouses, Mr. Peterson's wool suits, the Williamson children's school uniforms, each garment treated with a care their owners had never shown her. As she pressed the iron against the fabric, creating perfect creases and smooth surfaces, Ellen thought of the letter tucked in her pocket. The words had stopped stinging, replaced by a hollow ache that had become as familiar as the pain in her joints. At precisely 3 o'clock, Ellen bundled the freshly laundered clothes into separate packages, each labeled with their owner's name. She changed into her delivery outfit, a faded navy dress that had once belonged to Mrs. Fleming before a minor tear rendered it unwearable, and set out into the biting Chicago wind. If you are enjoying the story, type 5 in the comments and subscribe for more videos like this. If not, type 0. It helps me create even better content for you. Continuing. Ellen's first stop was the Harrisons' brownstone in Lincoln Park. As always, she entered through the service entrance at the back. The housekeeper, Mabel, greeted her with the customary look of mild disdain. "Mrs. Harrison said there was a spot on her peach blouse last time," Mabel said, examining the delivered garments with unnecessary scrutiny. She was most displeased. "I've taken extra care this time," Ellen replied, her voice steady despite the familiar sting of the accusation. She had spent nearly an hour on that blouse alone, using a special mixture for the delicate fabric. Mabel sniffed. "We'll see. The money's on the counter." Ellen counted the bills, $2 short of their agreed price. When she pointed this out, Mabel shrugged. "Consider it a fee for the inconvenience of the spot." This was how it always went. A small deduction here for an imagined slight, a little less there for invented imperfections. Over the years, Ellen had learned not to argue. The affluent neighborhoods of Chicago operated by different rules than the rest of the city, rules that invariably benefited those who made them. By the time Ellen finished her deliveries, darkness had fallen over the city. The temperature had dropped further, and her thin coat did little to shield her from the biting wind. Her hands, perpetually red and chapped from years of harsh soaps and hot water, ached fiercely in the cold. She stopped at the corner market to buy her dinner, a can of soup and a small loaf of day-old bread. The cashier, Gloria, was one of the few people who greeted Ellen with genuine warmth. "You look tired today, Ellen," Gloria observed, bagging the meager purchases. "Those rich folks working you too hard again?" Ellen managed a small smile. "Just the usual. How's your daughter doing with her studies?" Gloria beamed. "She's thriving. That tuition assistance program was a godsend. She's talking about becoming a doctor now." "She'll make a fine one," Ellen said, genuinely happy for her friend. Gloria's daughter, Jasmine, was brilliant and determined, qualities Ellen had once seen in Freddie before ambition turned to shame. Back in her small apartment, Ellen heated her soup on the single-burner stove and settled at her tiny table. The silence of the room was broken only by the hum of the ancient refrigerator and the occasional drip from the leaking faucet. She ate, slowly, savoring each spoonful of the thin broth, stretching the meal as she'd learned to do decades ago when Freddie was small and money even tighter. After washing her single bowl and spoon, Ellen sat down at her sewing machine. This was her ritual, her sanctuary. The day's humiliations and aches faded as she threaded the needle and began to work on a jacket she'd been creating from discarded fabric scraps. Under her skilled hands, cast-off materials transformed into something beautiful, a talent no one but herself would ever appreciate. As she worked, Ellen thought about Mrs. Blackwell's words from earlier that week. The elderly socialite had watched Ellen fold her expensive linens with a critical eye. "You're almost 70, Ellen. You think anyone cares about your silly sewing? If you die tomorrow, the only thing they'll remember is you ironing my husband's shirts." Ellen said nothing. She bowed, picked up the basket of damp laundry, and left quietly. But those words burned in her mind like hot steam. That night, she whispered to her sewing machine, "Even if no one remembers, I will. I was more than their servant. I created beauty." The memory brought a renewed determination to her fingers. As they guided the fabric through the machine, She worked until midnight, completing the jacket, a patchwork creation of blues and greys that somehow looked coherent, elegant even. Ellen held it up, admiring how the different textures complemented each other. Then with a sigh, she folded it carefully and placed it in the trunk at the foot of her bed, alongside dozens of other garments she'd created over the years. These clothes, her clothes, would never be worn. They were made for imaginary people with imaginary lives far removed from the reality of her basement apartment and aching hands. But creating them kept her spirit alive in a world that seemed determined to grind it down to nothing. The next morning dawned grey and threatening snow. Ellen's joints protested as she rose from her thin mattress, the cold seeping through the walls and into her bones. Today was laundry day at the Blackwells, her least favourite clients but also her highest paying. Their enormous house in the Gold Coast neighbourhood contained more linens and garments than some small hotels, and Mrs. Blackwell's standards were impossibly high. As Ellen gathered her supplies, homemade starch, special soap for delicates, her own iron since the Blackwells was inferior, she braced herself for the criticism that would inevitably come. 7 years of working for the family had not earned her any respect. Only increased demands and the occasional cutting remark about her appearance or age. The bus ride to the Gold Coast was long and crowded. Ellen stood for most of the journey, clutching her supplies bag, while more affluent passengers took the seats without a second glance her way. She was invisible, just another aging service worker in a city full of them. Sometimes Ellen wondered if she would simply fade away completely one day, disappearing into the background of Chicago like a ghost no one had noticed in the first place. Mrs. Blackwell answered the door herself, unusual for a woman who typically delegated even the smallest tasks to her staff. "You're 3 minutes late," she said by way of greeting, checking her diamond-studded watch with a frown. "I apologize, Mum. The bus was delayed due to construction," Ellen explained, though she knew excuses, even truthful ones, were unwelcome. "Well, I have an emergency. Camilla Worthington has invited us to a last-minute benefit dinner tonight, and my gown has a tear in the sleeve. I need you to mend it immediately before you start on the regular laundry." Ellen followed Mrs. Blackwell to her massive dressing room, where a stunning emerald silk gown was laid out on a chaise lounge. The tear was small, but in a conspicuous location, right at the shoulder seam. It would require delicate work. "Can it be fixed?" Mrs. Blackwell demanded, hovering uncomfortably close as Ellen examined the damage. "Yes, ma'am. I'll need a matching thread, but I can repair it so the mend won't be visible," Mrs. Blackwell sniffed. "See that you do. I'll be checking on you in an hour." Left alone with the gown, Ellen set to work with the precision of someone who had been mending delicate fabrics for longer than Mrs. Blackwell had been alive. Her fingers, though stiff and painful, moved with surprising deftness as she selected a silk thread that perfectly matched the emerald fabric. The repair would require a special stitch, one her mother had taught her decades ago for working with fine silks. As she worked, Ellen allowed herself to imagine wearing such a gown. The silk would feel cool and smooth against her skin, so different from the rough cotton of her own clothes. She would enter a grand ballroom on the arm of a distinguished gentleman, turning heads not with the expertise of her laundry skills, but with her elegance and grace. The fantasy made her smile, even as her practical mind dismissed it as foolishness. Women like her didn't attend benefits at the Hilton. They washed the clothes of those who did. Precisely 55 minutes later, the repair was complete. Even under close inspection, the mend was virtually invisible, a perfect match of thread and technique that preserved the flow and drape of the expensive fabric. Mrs. Blackwell returned as promised, examining the gown with critical eyes. She held it up to the light, ran her fingers over the repaired seam, and finally gave a curt nod. "Acceptable," she pronounced, which from her was high praise indeed. "Now get started on the regular laundry. I'll need everything done by 5. The rest of Ellen's day passed in a blur of sorting, washing, ironing and folding. The Blackwells' laundry room was at least well equipped, with modern appliances that made the physical labor somewhat less taxing than it might have been. Still, by 4:30, when Ellen was pressing the last of Mr. Blackwell's shirts, her back ached fiercely and her feet felt swollen in her worn shoes. She was just folding the shirt when Mrs. Blackwell appeared again, now dressed in the repaired gown, which hugged her slim figure perfectly. A maid was arranging her hair while she barked instructions about which jewelry to bring. "Ellen," Mrs. Blackwell said suddenly, "do you know how much this gown cost?" Ellen paused in her folding. "No, ma'am. $6,000, imported from Paris." She smoothed the fabric over her hip with a satisfied expression. "More than you make in a year, I'd imagine." The casual cruelty of the remark hung in the air. Ellen merely nodded and returned to her task, her face betraying nothing of the hurt that bloomed inside her. This, too, was a skill honed over decades, the ability to become emotionless in the face of degradation. As she was preparing to leave, having completed all the required tasks, Mrs. Blackwell's personal assistant hurried into the laundry room. "Ellen, thank goodness you're still here. There's been a disaster with Sophia's ballet costume for tomorrow's recital. Coffee spilled all over it. Mrs. Blackwell is beside herself." The assistant thrust a small white tutu into Ellen's hands. The coffee stain spread across the front like an ugly brown continent on a map of snow. "I can't possibly stay late today," Ellen began, thinking of her bus schedule and the worsening weather outside. "Perhaps if Mrs. Blackwell could bring it to me tomorrow morning." "That won't do," the assistant interrupted. "The recital is at noon tomorrow. It needs to be perfect by then. Mrs. Blackwell said to tell you she'll add $20 to your pay if you can remove the stain completely." $20 was a significant sum to Ellen, nearly half a week's groceries. With a resigned sigh, she took the costume and returned to the laundry room. The stain proved stubborn, resistant to her usual treatments. Ellen tried increasingly specialized techniques, drawing on knowledge accumulated over 40 years of dealing with every imaginable type of spill on every possible fabric. After an hour of careful work, using a paste made from ingredients she carried in her supplies bag, the stain finally lifted, leaving the tutu pristine once more. It was nearly 7 o'clock when Ellen finally left the Blackwell mansion. The promised $20 had been left for her on the laundry room counter. No thank you, no acknowledgement of the extra hours or her success with what had been a particularly difficult stain. Outside, snow was falling heavily, and the temperature had dropped further. Ellen pulled her threadbare coat tighter around her thin frame and trudged toward the bus stop, her supplies bag now heavier with the damp cleaning rags she would wash. At home, the bus was late, delayed by the weather and rush-hour traffic. Ellen stood in the falling snow, her feet growing numb in her inadequate shoes, watching cars pass by with their warm interiors and oblivious passengers. When the bus finally arrived, it was so crowded that she again had to stand for the entire 40-minute journey back to her neighborhood. Walking the final 3 blocks to her apartment, Ellen felt a weariness that went beyond the physical exhaustion of the day. It was the bone-deep fatigue of a life spent in service to others, never recognized, never valued beyond the momentary utility of her skills. Mrs. Blackwell's casual remark about the gown's cost echoed in her mind. $6,000 for a piece of fabric, while Ellen worked 14-hour days to keep a roof over her head. Just as she turned onto her street, Ellen saw a young woman huddled in a doorway, crying. Her thin jacket offered little protection against the increasingly harsh weather, and she clutched a torn garment bag to her chest. "Are you all right, dear?" Ellen asked, momentarily forgetting her own discomfort in the face of another's distress. The girl looked up, revealing a tear-stained face framed by dark curls. She couldn't have been more than 20. "My interview outfit," she sobbed, opening the garment bag to reveal a navy dress with a long tear down the front. "I was rushing to get home before the storm got worse and it caught on a fence. My interview is at 9 tomorrow morning, and I've spent every cent I had on this dress." In the harsh glow of the street lamp, Ellen could see that the girl's shoes were as worn as her own, her hands red from the cold. There was a familiar desperation in her eyes, the look of someone for whom a single setback could derail everything. "What's your name?" Ellen asked gently. "Gabriella," the girl sniffled. "My interview is in the morning. I can't go like, and this, they'll think I'm trash." Ellen looked down at the dress. It was a decent quality piece, not expensive but well made and appropriate for a job interview. The tear, while significant, ran along a seam. "Come with me," Ellen said, making a decision that surprised even herself. 20 minutes later, they were in Ellen's small apartment. She had sat Gabriella down with a cup of hot tea while examining the damaged dress more closely. "It's fixable," Ellen assured her. "I can have it ready for you in the morning." "I can't pay you," Gabriella admitted, clutching the warm mug between her hands. "I spent my last money on bus fare." Ellen waved away her concern. "I don't need payment. Tell me about this interview while I work." As Ellen's skilled fingers repaired the torn seam, Gabriella explained that she was applying for an administrative position at Lakeside Designs, a small but growing fashion house in downtown Chicago. She had been taking night classes in business administration while working days as a waitress, saving every penny for this opportunity. "It would change everything for me," she said, watching with fascination as Ellen's needle moved swiftly through the fabric. "A real career, benefits, maybe even college tuition assistance eventually." Ellen nodded, understanding perfectly the desperate hope in the young woman's voice. How many times had she harbored similar dreams in her youth before life's harsh realities had ground them away? "Tell me, do you have family in Chicago?" Ellen asked, keeping her tone conversational as she worked. Gabriella shook her head. "I came here from Detroit 3 years ago. My parents, they weren't supportive of my ambitions. They wanted me to marry my high school boyfriend and settle down in our neighborhood." The parallel to Ellen's own life was so striking that she had to pause her sewing for a moment. She, too, had come to Chicago as a young woman, fleeing the limited expectations of her family in a small Minnesota town. The difference was that Gabriella still had a chance to build the life Ellen had once dreamed of. "This dress needs something more," Ellen said suddenly, an idea forming. "Wait here." She went to the trunk at the foot of her bed and opened it, revealing her carefully stored creations. After a moment's consideration, she selected a hand-embroidered collar she had made the previous winter, navy blue with subtle silver thread woven through it in an elegant pattern. It had been created with no particular garment in mind, simply for the pleasure of making something beautiful. "May I?" Ellen asked, holding up the collar next to Gabriella's dress. Gabriella's eyes widened. "It's gorgeous. Did you make that?" Ellen nodded, pleased by the genuine admiration in the girl's voice. "I think it will elevate your dress perfectly, professional but with a touch of distinction." Working quickly but meticulously, Ellen attached the collar to the dress, transforming the simple garment into something that looked custom-designed and considerably more expensive than it was. When she finished, she pressed the entire dress, ensuring it was perfectly wrinkle-free. "Try it on," she urged Gabriella. When the young woman emerged from the bathroom wearing the altered dress, Ellen caught her breath. The transformation was remarkable. The dress fit perfectly, and the unique collar drew attention to Gabriella's face, highlighting her intelligent eyes and determined expression. "I look—" Gabriella trailed off, staring at her reflection in Ellen's small mirror. "Professional, capable, ready," Ellen supplied, feeling an unfamiliar surge of pride. "You look like someone who deserves that job." Gabriella hugged her tightly, pressing her face against Ellen's shoulder. "Thank you. I don't even know how to repay you." Ellen patted her back. "Get the job. That's payment enough." After Gabriella left, promising to return the next day to share news of her interview, Ellen sat at her sewing machine for a long time. The encounter had awakened something she thought long dead, a sense of possibility, of her skills being truly valued rather than merely exploited. On impulse, she pulled out more fabric scraps and began working on a new design, her mind alive with ideas. The clock ticked past midnight, but Ellen didn't notice, lost in the creative flow that had eluded her for too long. Will Ellen's newfound purpose continue to blossom, or will the harsh realities of her life crush this fragile spark of inspiration? Will Gabriella return with good news, or will Ellen face yet another disappointment in her long, difficult life? The following morning, Ellen woke with a renewed sense of purpose. Her aches seemed less pronounced, overshadowed by anticipation. Today was Thursday, her day to launder for the Petersons and the Williams family, but her mind kept drifting to Gabriella's interview. Would the dress make a difference? Would the girl recognize her own worth when clothed in something that reflected her aspirations rather than her circumstances? Ellen worked through her morning clients efficiently, her hands performing the familiar tasks while her imagination wandered. She found herself noticing details of construction in the garments she handled, the precise dart on Mrs. Peterson's blazer, the clever seaming of young Jimmy Williams's school uniform, the subpar finishing on Miss Peterson's expensive blouse that had already begun to fray despite its designer label. "You seem cheerful today, Ellen," Mrs. Peterson remarked as Ellen delivered the freshly pressed clothes to their Wicker Park home. "Has something good happened?" The question caught Ellen off guard. Mrs. Peterson was generally kind, but rarely personal in their interactions. "Just feeling well today, ma'am," Ellen replied, defaulting to polite neutrality. "Well, it suits you," Mrs. Peterson said, counting out Ellen's payment. She hesitated, then added an extra $5. "For always taking such good care of Robert's suits. He has an important meeting today, and you've made him look impeccable as always." The unexpected gesture and kind words warmed Ellen more than the money itself. Perhaps there were people who did see value in her work beyond the mere functionality of clean clothes. By mid-afternoon, Ellen had completed her scheduled work and returned to her apartment. She found herself glancing frequently at the clock, wondering how Gabriella's interview had gone. The girl had promised to stop by, but Ellen was trying not to get her hopes up. Young people had busy lives. Promises were easily forgotten. To distract herself, Ellen returned to her sewing machine and the project she had started the night before, a blouse made from scraps of blue and cream fabrics she had salvaged over the years. Her design incorporated elements she had observed in the expensive clothes she laundered, but with her own unique touches. The result was something neither purely practical nor frivolously ornamental, but a perfect balance between the two. At 4 o'clock, a knock at the door startled Ellen from her work. She opened it to find Gabriella standing there, a huge grin on her face. "I got it!" the young woman exclaimed, practically bouncing with excitement. "They offered me the job on the spot." Ellen's face broke into a smile of genuine delight. Come in, tell me everything." Over cups of tea, Ellen, splurging on her good tea bags rather than the cheap ones she usually used, Gabriella recounted her interview experience. "The moment I walked in wearing this dress, I felt different," she explained, still dressed in the navy outfit with Ellen's special collar. "More confident, like I belonged there. And you wouldn't believe it, the hiring manager actually commented on the collar. She said she'd never seen anything like it, asked if it was a European designer." Ellen felt a flush of pleasure at the words. "What did you tell her?" "I told her the truth, that a very talented woman had created it specially for the dress. That's when everything changed. She called in the owner of the company, Mr. Davis, and had me explain again about the collar. Gabriella reached into her purse and pulled out a business card, handing it to Ellen. Mr. Davis asked if you might be willing to meet with him. He said, and I'm quoting here, "Anyone who can transform a basic department store dress into something that caught Vivian's eye has talent worth exploring." Ellen stared at the card in her hand, glossy white stock with embossed blue lettering. Gregory Davis, founder and creative director, Lakeside Designs. "I don't understand," Ellen said slowly. "What would a fashion designer want with me?" Gabriella leaned forward eagerly. "He's looking for unique perspectives. Lakeside Designs is becoming known for incorporating unusual elements and techniques into their clothing line. When I mentioned that you've been sewing your own designs for years, his eyes lit up. He specifically mentioned wanting to see your work." Ellen shook her head, panic rising in her chest. No, I couldn't possibly. My things aren't there. Just scraps, just ways to pass the time." "Ellen," Gabriella said gently, "will you at least show me what you've made? The things you keep in that trunk?" After a moment's hesitation, Ellen nodded. Together they opened the old trunk, and Ellen began removing her creations one by one. Dresses, blouses, jackets, each piece unique and crafted with remarkable skill from materials most would have discarded. Gabriella handled each garment with reverence, examining the construction, the creative use of different fabrics, the unexpected details that elevated each piece. "These are amazing," she breathed, holding up a jacket made from what had once been denim workwear and silk scarves, transformed into something both practical and subtly elegant. "This isn't just sewing, Ellen. This is art." For the first time in decades, Ellen allowed herself to see her work through someone else's eyes, not as the meaningless hobby of an aging laundress, but as legitimate creative expression worthy of admiration. "I've never shown these to anyone," she admitted, watching as Gabriella tried on a vest Ellen had constructed from scraps of tweed and brocade. "Who would be interested in the sewing projects of someone like me?" "Mr. Davis would," Gabriella said firmly, twirling to see how the vest moved. "Ellen, the fashion world is changing. There's growing interest in sustainable design, in repurposing materials, in authentic craftsmanship with a story behind it. Your work embodies all of that." Ellen's mind reeled with possibilities she had never allowed herself to consider. Could her lifetime of invisible labor, of creating beauty no one saw, actually lead to something at this late stage of her life? "I'm almost 70 years old," she said quietly. "It's too late for new beginnings." Gabriella took Ellen's work-worn hands in her own. "It's never too late. Please, just meet with him. Bring a few pieces. What's the worst that could happen?" What indeed, Ellen thought. She had endured countless humiliations over the decades. One more rejection would hardly break her. And if by some miracle this fashion designer did see value in her work, the possibility was almost too overwhelming to contemplate. "I'll think about it," Ellen promised. After Gabriella left, Ellen sat alone in her apartment, Gregory Davis's business card propped against her sewing machine. The practical part of her mind urged caution. People like her didn't get opportunities like this. It was safer to continue as she always had, expecting nothing, protecting herself from inevitable disappointment. But another voice, one that had been silenced for too long, whispered of possibilities. What if this was her chance to be seen, to have the talent she had nurtured in secret finally recognized? Ellen picked up the phone, and before she could talk herself out of it, dialed the number on the card. "Lakeside Designs," a receptionist answered. "My name is Ellen Martinez," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. "I'd like to speak with Mr. Gregory Davis. Have you ever had an unexpected turn of events that changed your life's trajectory? Has someone ever recognized a talent in you that others overlooked? Share your experience in the comments below," the receptionist put, Ellen on hold, and for several nerve-wracking minutes she considered hanging up. This was folly, surely, a waste of time for everyone involved. But then a deep, warm voice came on the line. "Mrs. Martinez, I was hoping you'd call. Gabriella spoke very highly of your work." Ellen clutched the phone tighter. "Mr. Davis, I'm afraid there may have been some misunderstanding. I'm just a laundress who sews as a hobby." "From what Gabriella described, you're considerably more than that," he replied. "I'd very much like to see your creations. Would you be comfortable bringing a few pieces to our studio tomorrow morning?" Tomorrow? Ellen's mind raced. She had the Blackwell's laundry scheduled, a commitment she had never missed in 7 years. "I have work obligations," she began hesitantly. "We could make it afternoon then," Mr. Davis offered, his tone suggesting he was not accustomed to being refused. "Say 3 o'clock, I'll have my car pick you up." "A car for her?" Ellen stared at her reflection in the small mirror above her sink. An aging woman with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical bun, deep lines etched around her eyes and mouth, hands red and calloused from decades of harsh work. Not the sort of person who was sent cars or invited to design studios. Yet the sincerity in Mr. Davis's voice was unmistakable. 3 o'clock would be fine, Ellen heard herself saying, but please don't trouble yourself with a car. I can take the bus. Nonsense, Mr. Davis insisted. Consider it part of our interview process. Gabriella will provide your address. Bring 5 or 6 pieces that you feel best represent your work. After hanging up, Ellen sat motionless for several minutes, processing what had just happened. An interview. A fashion designer wanted to interview her about her creations, the same creations Mrs. Blackwell had dismissed as silly sewing. Ellen stood and walked to her trunk, opening it to survey its contents. Which pieces should she take? What would this sophisticated man, this professional designer, want to see? For the first time, Ellen looked at her work with a critical, evaluating eye rather than simply as the product of stolen moments of pleasure. The jacket she had completed just last week, a symphony of blues and greys that somehow worked harmoniously together despite their disparate origins. The dress she had created from an abandoned silk curtain and scraps of lace from a damaged wedding gown. The vest Gabriella had admired, with its surprising combination of textures, the blouse with the intricate smocking detail she had learned from her mother. Each piece told a story, not just of the materials used, but of the moments in Ellen's life when they were created. The jacket had been sewn after a particularly humiliating encounter with Mrs. Blackwell's son, who had questioned her literacy in front of houseguests. The dress had come together during the lonely Christmas when Freddie first failed to call. The vest had been a project to distract herself from the pain of an untreated tooth infection she couldn't afford to have fixed. Beauty born from pain, creativity as survival. These garments weren't just clothes. They were testament to Ellen's endurance, her refusal to be diminished despite a lifetime of being treated as less than. For the first time, Ellen allowed herself to feel truly proud of what she had created. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Ellen called Mrs. Blackwell early, fabricating a story about a doctor's appointment she couldn't reschedule. "This is extremely inconvenient," Mrs. Blackwell complained. "I'm hosting a dinner party tomorrow night. I can come early on Saturday." "Instead," Ellen offered, holding her breath. She had never altered her schedule in 7 years of employment. After a moment of pointed silence, Mrs. Blackwell agreed, though her tone promised future recriminations. Ellen felt a momentary pang of guilt for the deception, quickly replaced by a novel sensation, anticipation. The morning of Ellen's appointment with Lakeside Designs, she spent unusual care on her appearance. She washed her hair with the special, or shampoo she normally saved for holidays, and selected her best dress, a navy blue piece she'd purchased 5 years ago for Freddie's college graduation, an event she'd ultimately not been invited to attend. The dress hung looser on her frame now, but it was clean and dignified, much like Ellen herself. At precisely 2:45 p.m., a sleek black car pulled up outside her building. The driver, a young man in a crisp uniform, actually opened the door for her. Ellen clutched her garment bag, containing 5 carefully selected pieces, and slid into the back seat, feeling terribly out of place. "First time in a town car, ma'am?" the driver asked kindly, noticing her discomfort. "Is it that obvious?" Ellen replied with a small smile. "Only because you're not ignoring me while typing on your phone," he chuckled. "Most of my passengers don't even look up." The drive to downtown Chicago took nearly 40 minutes in the afternoon traffic. Ellen watched the neighborhoods change through the window, from her working-class area to increasingly affluent districts, finally arriving at a renovated warehouse in the West Loop. A discreet sign beside the entrance read, "Lakeside Designs," in elegant blue lettering. "I'll wait for you, ma'am," the driver said. "Mr. Davis said to tell you to take your time." The building's interior was a study in contrasts. Exposed brick walls and pipes, juxtaposed with gleaming modern furniture and art. Ellen approached the reception desk with trepidation. "Ellen Martinez to see Mr. Davis," she said, her voice barely audible. The receptionist, a young woman with a sleek bob and fashionable glasses, immediately smiled in recognition. "Yes, we've been expecting you. Please follow me." Ellen was led through an open workspace where a dozen people were sketching, draping fabric on mannequins, or working at computers. The energy in the room was palpable, creative, and utterly foreign to Ellen's experience. No one looked up as she passed. She was still invisible, but in an entirely different way. The receptionist knocked on a glass door at the far end of the space. "Mr. Davis, Mrs. Martinez is here." Gregory Davis rose from behind a large desk covered with fabric swatches and sketches. He was younger than Ellen had expected, perhaps in his early 50s, with salt and pepper hair and keen blue eyes behind stylish glasses. He extended his hand with a warm smile. "Mrs. Martinez, thank you for coming. Please sit down." He gestured to a comfortable chair opposite his desk. Ellen perched on the edge, clutching her garment bag like a shield. "Thank you for the invitation, Mr. Davis, but I'm afraid Gabriella may have exaggerated my abilities." "I'll be the judge of that," he replied, his tone kind but professional. "May I?" He gestured to the garment bag. With trembling hands, Ellen unzipped the bag and carefully removed each piece, laying them across the desk. Davis said nothing as he examined each garment, his expression unreadable. He touched the fabrics, inspected the seams, turned pieces inside out to study the construction. The silence stretched until Ellen felt she might shatter from the tension. Finally, he looked up. "These are extraordinary." Ellen blinked. "Excuse me?" "Your technical skill is impeccable," he continued, holding up the blue-gray jacket to examine a particularly complex seam. "But what truly interests me is your design, sensibility. You have an intuitive understanding of how disparate elements can work together harmoniously. That's something that can't be taught." Ellen felt heat rising to her cheeks. In 40 years, no one had ever spoken about her work this way. "They're just scraps," she murmured. "No," Davis said firmly. "They're carefully considered compositions that happen to be wearable. The fact that you've created them from reclaimed materials makes them even more remarkable." He paused, studying her face. "Mrs. Martinez, how long have you been designing clothing?" The question caught her off guard. I just sew. For pleasure. I've never considered it designing. Yet here are 5 uniquely designed garments that reflect a consistent aesthetic vision," Davis replied, gesturing to her pieces. "Tell me about your background. Did you study fashion formally?" Ellen almost laughed at the absurdity of the question. "No, Mr. Davis. I've been a laundress my entire adult life. I learned to sew from my mother, who was a seamstress for a department store. And these materials, where do they come from? Scraps, mostly. Damaged items my clients were discarding. Thrift store finds. Sometimes I repurpose my own old clothes." Ellen touched the sleeve of the blue jacket. This was once a pair of workman's trousers and part of a silk blouse that got torn. Davis nodded thoughtfully. "At Lakeside Designs, we've been exploring sustainable fashion, using reclaimed materials, reducing waste, honoring traditional craftsmanship. Your work embodies these principles beautifully." He stood suddenly. "I'd like my design team to see these. Would that be all right?" Before Ellen could respond, Davis had called in 3 younger designers. They gathered around the desk, examining Ellen's creations with professional interest. Their comments flowed around her, terms like structural integrity, tonal cohesion, and textural contrast, as they discussed her work as if she weren't present. "The hand-stitching on this collar is remarkable," said a young woman with an accent Ellen couldn't place. "This technique is similar to what my grandmother used in Korea, but with a completely different application. And look at this transition between fabrics," added a man with a colorful scarf draped around his neck. "It's architectural." Ellen sat silently, overwhelmed by the experience of having her secret pastime dissected by professionals. These people spoke a language she had never learned, but somehow instinctively understood. Eventually, Davis dismissed the team and turned back to Ellen. "Mrs. Martinez, I'd like to make you a proposition." Ellen's heart raced. "What sort of proposition?" "Lakeside Designs is launching a new collection focused on sustainable luxury. I would like to include several pieces inspired by your work. We would compensate you, of course, and give you full credit as a collaborative designer." Ellen stared at him, certain she had misheard. "Mr. Davis, I'm nearly 70 years old. I have no credentials, no education in fashion. Surely you can find someone more qualified." "On the contrary," he replied, leaning forward, "your lack of formal training is precisely what makes your perspective valuable. You haven't been constrained by conventional rules. And your age? That represents decades of developed skill and wisdom that my young designers simply don't possess." He named a figure for her compensation that made Ellen's eyes widen. It was more than she earned in 6 months of laundry work. I don't know what to say," she stammered. "Say yes," Davis smiled. "We'd start with a 3-month contract. You'd work with our team 2 days a week, consulting on the development of pieces inspired by your aesthetic. If the collaboration is successful, we could discuss a more permanent arrangement." Ellen's mind raced. 2 days a week would mean reducing her laundry clients, but the compensation would more than make up for the loss of income. Still, the prospect of entering this unfamiliar world was terrifying. "Could I think about it?" she asked hesitantly. "Of course," Davis replied, though his expression suggested he wasn't used to people needing time to consider his offers. "Take the weekend. Call me on Monday." On the ride home, Ellen sat in stunned silence, clutching her now empty garment bag. Davis had insisted on keeping her pieces for further study, promising their safe return regardless of her decision. The driver attempted conversation a few times, but eventually left her to her thoughts when it became clear she was too overwhelmed to respond. Back in her apartment, Ellen made herself a cup of tea with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. The events of the afternoon felt like a dream, surreal and disconnected from the reality of her life. For 40 years, she had been invisible, her talents unrecognized, her worth measured only in laundered shirts and pressed linens. Now, suddenly, a successful designer wanted her input, valued her perspective, saw worth in skills she had developed, in stolen moments between endless loads of other people's laundry. Ellen reached for the phone, desperate to share the news with someone who would understand its significance, but there was no one. Freddie was gone from her life by his own choice. Her few acquaintances were other service workers who would likely greet her news with skepticism or, worse, envy. Instead, she sat at her sewing machine, running her fingers over its familiar curves. This faithful companion had been her confidant through decades of loneliness and struggle. Now it might become something more, a tool of legitimate creative expression, valued by others. What would Freddie think if he knew? Would it change how he saw her? Would he still be ashamed of the mother who had sacrificed everything to give him opportunities she had never had? The following morning, Ellen woke early, her mind made up. She would accept Davis's offer. At 69, she had spent enough of her life invisible. If there was a chance, however slim, to be seen, truly seen, for her talents rather than her utility, she would take it. But first, she had the Blackwell's laundry. Ellen approached the task with a new perspective, noting the construction of each garment with professional interest as she worked. The expensive fabrics, once objects of distant admiration, now revealed their secrets to her practiced eye. The shortcuts taken in supposedly luxury items, the machine stitching passed off as handcrafted, the superficial details that justified inflated prices. Mrs. Blackwell was in a particularly demanding mood, finding fault with Ellen's work despite its perfect execution. "This pleat isn't sharp enough," she complained, examining a tablecloth with critical eyes. "And these napkins feel damp still." "I'll refold the pleat, ma'am," Ellen replied, taking the tablecloth. As for the napkins, they were perfectly dry, as Mrs. Blackwell well knew. As Ellen reworked the pleat under Mrs. Blackwell's watchful eye, the woman continued her litany of complaints. "The service staff these days is so inadequate. My friend Caroline pays her laundress twice what I pay you, and the woman still managed to ruin a silk blouse last week." Ellen bit her tongue, focusing on creating a knife-sharp pleat in the expensive linen. In the past, such comments had stung. Today, they washed over her like water off well-waxed fabric. "You know, Ellen," Mrs. Blackwell continued, oblivious to Ellen's inner shift, "at your age, you should be grateful to have steady work. Most people in your position would have been replaced by someone younger by now." Ellen looked up, meeting Mrs. Blackwell's eyes directly, something she had rarely done in 7 years of employment. "You're absolutely right, Mrs. Blackwell. I am fortunate." Something in Ellen's tone caused a flicker of uncertainty to cross the other woman's face. For a brief moment, the power dynamic between them wavered. "Well," Mrs. Blackwell said, recovering quickly, "just make sure those napkins are properly dried before you leave." Ellen completed her tasks with meticulous care, as always. But as she prepared to leave, she did something unprecedented. "Mrs. Blackwell, I need to adjust my schedule going forward. I'll only be available 3 days a week beginning next week." The woman stared at her in undisguised shock. "That's out of the question. You've always worked for us on Tuesdays and Saturdays." "I understand that creates an inconvenience," Ellen replied, her voice steady. "I can recommend another laundress who does excellent work, or we can adjust which days I come, but I'm afraid my availability is changing." "And may I ask why?" Mrs. Blackwell's tone had turned frigid. Ellen hesitated. Part of her wanted to explain, to see the disbelief and subsequent reassessment in the other woman's eyes. But something held her back, a desire to keep this new beginning private, protected from Mrs. Blackwell's inevitable diminishment. "Personal reasons," she said simply. "I see." Mrs. Blackwell's lips pressed into a thin line. "Well, I suppose we'll have to accommodate your personal reasons. Thursdays and Fridays would be acceptable." "Thank you for understanding," Ellen replied, gathering her supplies. As she walked to the door, she felt Mrs. Blackwell's puzzled gaze on her back, the first time in 7 years the woman had truly looked at her. Outside, Ellen took a deep breath of crisp autumn air. A weight she hadn't known she was carrying had lifted from her shoulders. Whether the fashion venture succeeded or failed, something fundamental had changed inside her. She had glimpsed a version of herself long forgotten, a woman with value beyond her utility, with a voice worth hearing. On Monday morning, Ellen called Gregory Davis and accepted his offer. 2 days later, she entered Lakeside Designs as a collaborating designer rather than a curiosity. The design team greeted her with professional respect, if some initial wariness. Ellen understood their hesitation. She was an outsider, untrained, from a world entirely separate from theirs. You're never too old to begin a new chapter, but can Ellen truly bridge the gap between her old life and this unexpected opportunity? Will her unique perspective be valued, or will she find herself once again invisible in a different environment? The first few weeks at Lakeside Designs passed in a blur of unfamiliar activities. Ellen learned the language of professional fashion. Terms like colorways, silhouettes, and merchandising gradually becoming part of her vocabulary. She sat in design meetings, offering hesitant input that became more confident as she realized her perspective was genuinely valued. Her workspace was a small desk in the corner of the design studio, equipped with a mood board where she pinned fabric swatches and sketches. Ellen had never considered herself an artist, but under Gregory Davis's patient guidance, she learned to translate her ideas into simple drawings that the technical designers could interpret. "Don't worry about making perfect sketches," Davis advised during her second week. "Just capture the essence of what you envision. Our technical team can develop the patterns." What Ellen lacked in formal training, she made up for in practical knowledge. When a young designer complained about a fabric not draping correctly, Ellen suggested a different seam construction that solved the problem immediately. When another struggled with an asymmetrical hemline, Ellen demonstrated a hand-stitching technique that created exactly the effect he wanted. "Where did you learn that?" the young man asked, watching in fascination. Ellen smiled. "From 40 years of fixing other people's clothes. When something tears along a bias seam, you learn what works and what doesn't." Gradually, the wariness of the younger designers transformed into genuine respect. They began to seek Ellen out, asking for her input on technical challenges or opinions on material combinations. Her perspective, shaped by necessity and practicality rather than trend forecasts or fashion school dogma, provided a grounding influence on the team's more experimental impulses. In her third week, Davis asked Ellen to present her inspiration for the Sustainable Luxury Collection to the entire company. The prospect terrified her. Speaking to a room full of educated professionals about her creative process seemed laughable. But Davis was insistent. "Your story is powerful, Ellen. It adds meaning and authenticity to the collection. Our customers don't just want beautiful clothes anymore. They want clothes with purpose, with narrative." The morning of the presentation, Ellen stood before the bathroom mirror in her apartment, barely recognizing herself. The design team had gifted her a jacket they had created based on her blue-gray patchwork piece, but refined for production. It fit her perfectly, honoring her original vision while elevating it through professional execution. At the office, Ellen's hands trembled as Davis introduced her to the assembled staff. Designers, marketing team, sales representatives, production managers. Nearly 40 people sat watching her expectantly. "I'm not used to speaking to groups," Ellen began hesitantly. "For most of my life, my job has been to be invisible, to clean and press and mend without being noticed." She took a deep breath and continued, her voice growing stronger. "I started sewing when I was 8 years old. My mother taught me using scraps from the department store where she worked. We couldn't afford to waste anything, so we learned to see potential in what others discarded." Ellen described how her sewing had sustained her through decades of difficult work and personal heartbreak, becoming both escape and expression. As she spoke, she showed examples of her work, now professionally photographed for the presentation, explaining the origin of each material and the techniques she had developed. When you've spent 40 years handling other people's beautiful clothes you could never afford to buy, you develop a different relationship with fashion, she explained. You understand the inside of a garment as intimately as the outside. You know which expensive details actually matter for longevity and which are just for show. By the time Ellen finished speaking, the room was silent. Then, to her amazement, the audience broke into enthusiastic applause. Several people wiped tears from their eyes. "That," said the marketing director afterward, "is exactly the story our brand needs. Authentic, meaningful, and completely differentiated from our competitors." In the following days, Ellen's schedule intensified. The collection was slated for a soft launch in 3 months, lightning fast in the fashion world, with a major presentation to follow if the initial response was positive. Ellen found herself at the center of a creative whirlwind, her ideas and techniques becoming the foundation for a collection that grew more exciting by the day. The long hours and mental demands were exhausting, but Ellen had never felt more alive. For the first time in decades, she was using all of herself, not just her hands, but her mind, her creativity, her accumulated wisdom. When she returned to her apartment in the evenings, she would often sit at her old Singer machine, working through new ideas or simply enjoying the familiar rhythm of a skill that had become second nature. One evening in her 6th week at Lakeside, Ellen was working late, alone in the design studio. Most of the staff had gone home hours earlier, but she had become absorbed in adapting a complex patchwork technique for production feasibility. A noise at the door startled her. "I'm sorry," said a deep voice. "I didn't mean to frighten you." Ellen looked up to see Gregory Davis standing in the doorway, his tie loosened, jacket slung over his shoulder. "Not frightened," she assured him. "Just lost in thought." Davis entered the room, pulling up a chair beside her desk. "You know, when I offered you this position, I expected you to bring valuable perspective to our team. What I didn't anticipate was how completely you would transform our creative process." Ellen felt a flush of pleasure at his words. "Everyone has been very kind about my input." "It's not kindness, Ellen. It's professional recognition of exceptional talent." Davis ran a hand through his silver-streaked hair. "The team meetings are more productive. The designs have more integrity. There's an excitement in the studio I haven't felt in years." "I'm glad," Ellen said simply. Davis hesitated, then continued. "Your 3-month contract will be up soon. I'd like to discuss a permanent position." Ellen's heart raced. A permanent position would mean leaving her laundry work entirely. A complete transformation of her life at an age when most people were settling into retirement. "What exactly would that entail?" she asked cautiously. "Senior design consultant, focusing on our sustainable luxury initiative. The role would be tailored to your strengths, developing new techniques for repurposing materials, mentoring younger designers in construction methods, contributing to the conceptual direction of collections." He named a salary that made Ellen catch her breath, more than she had earned in her 3 best years of laundry work combined. "That's very generous," she managed to say. Davis shook his head. "It's market rate for someone with your expertise. The fact that your expertise wasn't acquired through conventional channels doesn't make it less valuable." Ellen considered the offer, turning it over in her mind. "Could I have a few days to think about it?" "Of course," Davis replied, standing to leave. "But Ellen, don't sell yourself short. You belong here." After he left, Ellen sat motionless, absorbing his words. "You belong here." When was the last time anyone had said that to her? Had anyone ever? The next morning, Ellen rose early and dressed with care. Today she would visit her 3 remaining laundry clients to inform them of her pending career change. The conversations would be difficult, especially with Mrs. Blackwell, who had been increasingly cold since Ellen reduced her availability. Mrs. Peterson received the news with genuine happiness. "Ellen, that's wonderful. What an amazing opportunity. At your stage of life." Mrs. Williams was similarly supportive, hugging Ellen warmly. "We'll miss your magic touch with Jimmy's soccer uniforms, but this sounds like a dream come true." Mrs. Blackwell was a different matter entirely. She listened to Ellen's explanation with narrowed eyes and compressed lips. "A fashion designer?" she said finally, her tone dripping with skepticism. "At your age, after spending your life as a laundress?" The words were designed to wound, to remind Ellen of her place. In the past, they would have succeeded, reinforcing Ellen's own doubts about her worth. Today, they merely revealed Mrs. Blackwell's limitations. "Yes," Ellen replied calmly, "it seems my experience has value in contexts I never anticipated. Life is full of surprises." Mrs. Blackwell's expression hardened. "Well, don't expect to come back when this fashion experiment fails. Good help is hard to find, but not irreplaceable." Ellen nodded, accepting the implied dismissal with equanimity. "I understand. Thank you for the years of employment, Mrs. Blackwell. I've learned a great deal in your service." It was the truth, though perhaps not in the way Mrs. Blackwell might assume. Ellen had learned patience, perseverance, and the ability to create beauty, even when surrounded by coldness. These were lessons she would carry into her new life. As Ellen walked away from the Blackwell mansion for the final time, she felt a burden lifting. For 40 years, she had defined herself as others saw her, invisible, replaceable, valued only for her utility. Now, at 69, she was being offered the chance to redefine herself on her own terms. That evening, as Ellen sat at her sewing machine working on a new design concept, her phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. "Hello?" she answered cautiously. "Mom?" The voice was deeper than she remembered, but instantly recognizable. "It's Freddie." Ellen's hand tightened on the receiver. "Freddie, how are you?" I'm good, Mom." He sounded nervous, uncertain. "Look, this is going to sound strange, but I was in a waiting room today and picked up a fashion magazine. There was a feature about an upcoming designer collection, and there was your picture, your name." Ellen closed her eyes. Of course. The marketing team had begun their preliminary publicity campaign, including a profile of her in several industry publications. "Yes," she said simply, "that was me." "Mom, why didn't you tell me? The article said you've been designing for years, that your work is revolutionary. It talked about your sustainable methods, your unique techniques. Would you have been interested?" "Freddie?" Ellen asked quietly. The silence on the other end of the line was answer enough. "I saw your picture," he continued eventually. "You looked different. Happy." "I am happy," Ellen confirmed. "It's been an unexpected change, but a welcome one." Another silence stretched between them, filled with a decade of estrangement and unspoken hurts. "I told them you were a nurse," Freddie finally said, his voice barely audible. "I was ashamed. Now you're in fashion magazines, and I'm the one who looks small." Ellen felt a complex mix of emotions, vindication, sadness, a lingering maternal protectiveness despite everything. "We all make choices based on what we believe will protect us," she said gently. "I understand why you needed distance from your beginnings." Would it be possible to see you? I'm coming to Chicago next month for a conference. Maybe we could have dinner." Ellen thought of the letter she had received nearly 2 months ago. the cold dismissal that had sparked her journey to this new life. She thought of the years of silence, the granddaughter she had never met, the achievements she had celebrated alone. She also thought of forgiveness, not as a gift to Freddie, but as a release for herself. Holding on to hurt required energy she would rather direct toward her new beginning. "I'd like that," she said. "Call me when you know your schedule." After hanging up, Ellen sat for a long time processing the conversation. She had spent decades defined by her relationship to others, someone's laundress, someone's mother. Now finally, she was being recognized for who she was in herself, her talent, her vision, her unique perspective shaped by a life that had been difficult but entirely her own. The next morning, Ellen called Gregory Davis and accepted his offer of permanent employment. Then she sat down at her sewing machine and began working on a new design. A woman's jacket inspired by a laundress's apron, transformed through skilled hands into something beautiful and dignified. Something with a history and a future. Something, like Ellen herself, is it ever too late for transformation? Can the invisible become seen? For Ellen Martinez, the answer was emerging with each stitch, each design, each day of her unexpected new chapter. The woman who had washed other people's clothes for 40 years was now creating garments that would carry her name and her story into the world. What began with a simple act of kindness toward a young woman with a torn dress had blossomed into a complete reinvention. Ellen's hands, once red and raw from decades of harsh soaps and hot water, now moved confidently across sketches and fabrics in the bright studio of Lakeside Designs. Her voice, once hesitant and apologetic, now commanded attention. In design meetings, her ideas, once expressed only in secret creations, now formed the foundation of a collection that industry insiders were already buzzing about. 6 months later, Ellen stood backstage at Chicago's premier fashion venue, watching as models were dressed in garments bearing her influence. The collection, officially titled Second Chapter, but already nicknamed the Ellen Line by fashion blogs, represented a perfect fusion of Ellen's practical wisdom and Lakeside's contemporary vision. A young assistant approached, clipboard in hand. "5 minutes until showtime, Ms. Martinez. Mr. Davis is looking for you." Ms. Martinez. The formal address still startled Ellen sometimes, so different from the dismissive Ellen she had answered to for decades. She found Gregory Davis checking final details on the runway setup. When he saw her, his face broke into a warm smile. "Nervous?" he asked. Ellen considered the question. "Strangely, no. These clothes represent everything I've learned and felt over a lifetime. Whether they're well received or not doesn't change their truth." Davis nodded approvingly. "That's exactly why this collection feels so authentic. You're not chasing trends or approval. You're expressing something genuine." The lights dimmed, signaling the show's imminent start. Ellen took her assigned seat in the front row, beside the other senior designers. The music began, a reimagined version of a folk song her mother used to hum while sewing, and the first model appeared on the runway. Ellen watched with a curious detachment as her designs came to life on moving bodies. There was the jacket inspired by workman's clothes, now rendered in fine Italian wool with hand-embroidered details. There was the dress developed from her patchwork techniques, transformed into a flowing evening gown that told a story of renewal with every carefully joined seam. There was the blouse with her signature collar, now featured on the cover of the program in every attendee's hands. As the final model completed her walk, Gregory Davis stepped onto the runway. "Ladies and gentlemen, Lakeside Designs is proud to present our second chapter collection. Tonight represents not just new designs, but a new philosophy. One that honors craftsmanship, sustainability, and the wisdom that comes from unexpected places." He extended his hand toward Ellen. "Please welcome the heart and soul of this collection, our senior design consultant, Ellen Martinez. The spotlight found Ellen, illuminating her for the audience. The applause was immediate and enthusiastic. Ellen rose slowly, smoothing the custom-made dress the team had created for her for this occasion. As she walked to join Davis on the runway, she caught sight of a familiar face in the second row. Freddie had come after all. Beside him sat a woman, who must be his wife, and a teenage girl who had Ellen's eyes. Ellen smiled at them as she passed, a gentle acknowledgement without expectation. Then she turned to face the audience, standing tall beside Gregory Davis as he detailed the collection's inspiration and innovative techniques. Camera flashes popped throughout the venue, fashion writers scribbled notes, buyers from major department stores nodded appreciatively. In that moment, Ellen Martinez, former invisible laundress, now visible artist, felt the full circle of her journey. The after-party buzzed with excited conversation. Ellen found herself surrounded by people eager to hear her story, to understand the path that had led to such unique designs. She answered their questions with simple honesty, neither hiding her humble beginnings nor dramatizing her transformation. "Ms. Martinez," called a voice she recognized. Gabriella approached, resplendent in a dress from the collection, a gift from Gregory Davis in recognition of her role in discovering Ellen. "The show was magnificent. Everyone's talking about your techniques." Ellen embraced the young woman warmly. "None of this would have happened without you, dear. How are you enjoying your position at Lakeside?" "It's everything I hoped for," Gabriella beamed. "Mr. Davis has even mentioned a management training program in the future." As they chatted, Ellen noticed Freddie hovering uncertainly nearby with his family. She excused herself from Gabriella and approached them. "I'm glad you could come," she said simply. Freddie looked different from her memories, more substantial, his boyish features matured into a man's face. "It was amazing, Mom. I had no idea." "Neither did I until recently," Ellen replied with a small smile. Freddie's wife stepped forward, extending her hand. "I'm Charlotte. It's an honor to meet you. Your work is extraordinary." "And this is Melissa," Freddie added, gently urging the teenage girl forward. "Your granddaughter." Ellen looked into the girl's face, so young, so full of possibilities. "Hello, Melissa. I'm very happy to meet you." "Dad says you make clothes from things other people throw away," Melissa said, studying Ellen with curious eyes. "I think that's really cool. I'm interested in environmental science. Perhaps you could visit my studio sometime," Ellen suggested. "There's a fascinating intersection between sustainable fashion and environmental concerns." Freddie looked hopeful. "We'd like that. Maybe next month? We could stay for a weekend." Ellen nodded, feeling neither triumph nor resentment, only a quiet peace. The past couldn't be undone, but the future remained unwritten. "I'd enjoy that." Later, as the party wound down, Ellen found a moment of solitude on the venue's balcony. The Chicago skyline glittered before her, the same city where she had spent decades in obscurity, now the backdrop for her emergence. Gregory Davis joined her, offering a glass of champagne. "To second chapters," he toasted. Ellen clinked her glass against his. "And to seeing value where others don't look." They stood in companionable silence, watching the city lights. Ellen thought about the journey that had brought her here, from the freezing basin of soapy water to this moment of recognition and possibility. "You know what the best part of all this is?" she said finally. "What's that?" Davis asked. "For the first time in my life, I'm not defined by what I do for others. I'm defined by what I create." Davis smiled. "That, Ellen Martinez, is the essence of transformation." In her tiny apartment that night, Ellen sat at her old Singer machine one last time. She had signed a lease on a new place, a small but sun-filled condo closer to the design studio, with a dedicated room for her sewing and sketching. Tomorrow, movers would pack her few possessions, and this chapter of her life would officially close. Ellen ran her hands over the worn machine, remembering the countless hours it had kept her company through loneliness and hardship. Unlike so many things in her life, it had never let her down, never judged her, never made her feel less than she was. "We've had quite a journey together, old friend," she whispered. The machine would come with her, of course. Not because she needed it anymore, with the professional equipment now available to her, but because it represented the thread of continuity in her story. Ellen picked up a scrap of fabric, the last remnant from her laundress days, and fed it through the machine. One final stitch in her old life before fully embracing the new. As the needle rose and fell, creating a perfect seam, Ellen smiled. She had spent 40 years washing other people's clothes. Now, at 69, she had become the designer she was always meant to be, creating garments that would be worn with pride, her name recognized, her story an inspiration to others who might believe their own second chapters impossible. The Zia transformation was complete. Congratulations! Type 9 in the comments so that I know you stayed until the end with me. Thank you for watching, and until tomorrow's story on this same channel.